Last week we studied Luke chapter 12, verses 15 through 20. Take heed and beware of covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of the things he possesses. And then Jesus tells a story, a parable, to explain his meaning. And that's in verses 16 through 18. Then he spoke a parable to them, saying, The ground of a certain rich man yielded plentifully. And he thought within himself, saying, What will I do, since I have no room to store my crops? So he said, I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build greater, and there I will store all my crops and my goods. So this rich man had a wonderful season of blessing in his crops. God provided bountifully for this man. But his thoughts were not of thankfulness for his bounty. The man didn't consider that he might give his surplus to the synagogue or to the poor of his region. He wants to save all of his goods, it said, and so he needs bigger storage bins. Now, of course, there's no crime in having a great year of crops or a great year in business. There's no sin in carefully thinking about what you would do if you had bounty from God. But no virtues are shown by this blessed man. He does not recognize that God has given him much. Maybe he just views it as good luck. And his long-term strategy is shown in verse 19. And I will say to my soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. So the rich man starts to dream about his future life, that he could live with such wealth. He can relax, no longer needing to work. He can retire fat and happy. And we often say in English the cliche, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. And this, in fact, is very similar to a verse in Isaiah. And then Paul quotes that verse in 1 Corinthians 15:32. Here's what Paul says. If in the manner of men I have fought with beasts at Ephesus, what advantage is it to me? If the dead do not rise, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. This is why the rich man shows himself to be such a fool in Jesus' parable, because he thinks about the near future, but he doesn't think at all about the far future. Paul says that if the pagans are right, and if there's no resurrection from the dead, then I'm suffering persecution for nothing. And if there's no afterlife, why should I get torn up by wild beasts in the amphitheater? So probably the most significant problem in the natural man or woman who's born in sin is blindness to the truth all around of the spiritual life. The only thing you can see in your natural state is yourself and your world and your selfish desires. You cannot see God. You can't see the truth behind the world. You can't see the future and the afterlife. And thus you can easily justify your selfishness as proper because you see and believe in nothing else. Now, a natural man is by nature a materialist. The Oxford Dictionary defines materialism as a tendency to consider material possessions and physical comfort as more important than spiritual values. So all humans are born materialists. Babies know nothing but the physical and emotional realms at first. Now, as they grow older, they can begin to think about abstract and spiritual things. But unless they are converted in their hearts, they cannot believe in God or the afterlife in any real way. So Jesus, in describing this rich man and his barns, concludes with the true problem in Luke 12, verse 20. But God said to him, Fool, this night your soul will be required of you. Then whose will those things be which you have provided? So first, notice a good logical reason that Jesus gives for the stupidity of this rich man. Upon his death, what good will all of these barns do him? None at all. I suspect that Jesus was referring here to Psalm 14:1 or Psalm 53:1, which are identical. So here's Psalm 14:1. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They have done abominable works. There is none who does good. Those verses and others that are similar show and imply that materialism or atheism contribute to and empower sinfulness. The evil, selfish heart of foolishness provides all kinds of evils or produces all kinds of evils. God looks down from heaven and sees lots of fools. Some people forget that even the most stable investments and possessions are risky. There are unforeseeable dangers to any commodity because of the savagery of life. So just take the case of barns, for instance. There are many potential dangers to barns. Fruits could spoil, grains could be eaten by mice or insects, Jars of oil could be stolen or confiscated by the Romans. Fires could burn it down. Floods could wash it away. High winds can knock it down. Earthquakes could knock it down. Termites could eat the wood. There's all kinds of problems that could destroy barns. But there's one foreseeable danger to the solidity of the rich man's wealth. And this is foreseeable, not unforeseeable like the other things. The foreseeable thing is that one night his soul will be required of him. If you're trapped in your own selfishness and believe foolishly that this life is all that you'll ever have, I challenge you to ask yourself, what if you're wrong? I suggest that you think about the future. A lot of people think of nothing but the present, and that's the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the lustful pride of life. That's all that's here in this world if you don't believe in God. So you need to think about the future, not just tomorrow and not just next year. What about the future after you die? That concludes the review. The text for today is just one verse, Luke 12:21, although I will expand on themes from the last several verses also. So let's read verses 13 to 21, the whole paragraph. Luke 12:13 to 21. Then one from the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Man, who made me a judge or arbitrator over you?" And he said to them, "Take heed and beware of covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of things he possesses." Then he spoke a parable to them, saying, "The ground of a certain rich man yielded plentifully. And he thought within himself, saying, 'What shall I do, since I have no room to store my crops?' So he said, 'I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build greater, and there I will store all my crops and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take up your ease, eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to him, 'Fool, this night your soul will be required of you. Then whose will those things be which you have provided? So is he who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God.'" Now there's two summary statements in this paragraph. First is the introductory statement, where Jesus tells the disciples to be wary of covetousness. The introductory statement is this: "For one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." So that's how Jesus opens this paragraph. Then Jesus ends the parable with a summary of the foolish or covetous man. "So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God." Now, taken together, you can see the negative version and the implied positive version that the fool has missed. Jesus here says that the fool is someone who lays up abundant treasures for himself, like possessions. If the man was not a fool, implies Jesus, he would lay up rich treasures with God. So Jesus is distinguishing between two kinds of treasures. There are temporal, temporary treasures, and there are eternal treasures. We know that the fool's treasures are temporary because possessions are temporary. They don't last forever. Or even if they do last forever, they don't remain yours forever. Even if you own lots of stuff, gold and silver on earth, and even if God purifies that gold and it's still here when you come back, it's not yours anymore. Since God is eternal, it is unlikely that any temporary thing will be a rich treasure in his view. So, what is it then that God considers to be rich or treasury that will be eternal? Well, if Jesus defines a fool as someone who views the abundance of possessions as treasures, how is it that so many people view their stuff as treasure? In fact, you could ask yourself, what is treasure? Well, the most common answer is that treasure is valuable stuff. Commodities like gold and silver and precious gems. When you talk about pirate hoards that they might have buried on some island, X marks the spot. And we believe that these thieves have buried riches to hide them for collecting later. Certainly, this is the normal way that the term treasures is used in the Bible. For example, Jeremiah 20, verse 5. Jeremiah 20, verse 5. "Moreover, I will deliver all the wealth of this city, all its produce, and all its precious things. All the treasures of the king of Judah I will give into the hands of their enemies, who will plunder them, seize them, and carry them to Babylon." So in this case, treasures are gold and silver and all kinds of precious things that the kings of Judah hoarded up in Jerusalem. And Nebuchadnezzar took them all to Babylon. Now the treasures or the riches are not in themselves evil. In fact, sometimes God promises us great blessings. If God gives you something, it can't be evil. For example, Deuteronomy 30, verse 9. Deuteronomy 30, verse 9. The Lord your God will make you abound in all the works of your hand, in the fruits of your body, in the increase of your livestock, and in the produce of your land for good. So here God promises to his obedient people that he will make them abound in everything. Their cattle will abound, their children will abound, their lands will abound. Everything is going to abound. That's riches. God promises them at least some riches. The problem, though, as Jesus showed in the parable of the rich man in his barns, is when a person comes to rely upon his wealth and forgets God and loves neither God nor his neighbor. And this is also shown in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 8, if you want to turn over there. Deuteronomy 8, verses 11 through 14. This is the danger of riches that Jesus is now talking about in Luke. Deuteronomy 8, 11 through 14. Beware that you do not forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments, his judgments, and his statutes, which I command you today, lest, when you have eaten and are full, and have built beautiful houses and dwell in them, and when your herds and your flocks multiply, and your silver and your gold multiply, and all that you have is multiplied, when your heart is lifted up and you forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. So God in the Old Testament says that the riches will corrupt you and you will forget God. Now the friends of Job were accusing him of this very thing. They were saying that God was crushing Job because Job had secretly loved his wealth and oppressed the poor. And here's his reply in Job chapter 31, verses 24 through 28. It's Job 31, 24 to 28. This is Job's reply to their accusation. If I have made gold my hope, or said to find gold, you are my confidence. If I have rejoiced because my wealth was great, and because my hand had gained much. If I observe the sun when it shines, or the moon moving in its brightness, so that my heart was secretly enticed, and my mouth has kissed my hand, these would be an iniquity deserving of judgment, for I would have denied God who is above. And what's interesting about that is that Job compares the sin of covetousness and greed to idolatry and denying God who is above. And that's exactly right. That's what it would be. Physical treasures are dangerous because they distract you from the spiritual life. When you're enamored by lovely trinkets on earth, you're not thinking of heavenly matters. There will be gold and silver and precious gems in heaven, or on the new earth, I should say, but they will no longer be valuable because there's no buying or selling. They will only have value because they're beautiful and show God's amazing bounty in creation. So now I want you to turn over to Revelation chapter 18. There's a great passage in Revelation you should see about the great sin of Babylon. Now, Babylon is the biblical symbol of an evil satanic city. It's the opposite of Jerusalem, the city of God. So I want you to read. Now, actually, the whole chapter is about Babylon, but we're just going to read verses 10 through 17. Revelation 18, 10 through 17. Standing at a distance for fear of her torment, saying, Alas, alas, that great city Babylon, that mighty city, for in 1 hour your judgment has come. And the merchants of earth will weep and mourn over her, for no one buys their merchandise anymore. Merchandise of gold and silver, precious stones and pearls, fine linen and purple, silk and scarlet, every kind of citron wood, every kind of object of ivory, every kind of object of the most precious wood, bronze, iron, and marble, cinnamon and incense, fragrant oil and frankincense, wine and oil, fine flour and wheat, cattle and sheep, horse and chariots, and the bodies and souls of men. The fruit that your soul longed for has gone from you, and all the things which are rich and splendid are gone from you, and you will find them no more at all. The merchants of these things who became rich by her will stand at a distance for fear of her torment, weeping and wailing and saying, "Alas, alas, that great city that was clothed in fine linen, purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls. For in 1 hour those great riches came to nothing." That's a pretty amazing passage about the sin of Babylon, the sin of greed. You see, there is no permanence to earthly treasures. They're listed there. There's a huge variety: gold, silver, gems, pearls, clothing, silk, rare woods, ivory, bronze, iron, marble, spices, incense, oil, alcohol, fine foods, animals, weapons, and slaves. And these will no longer be traded or sold, for in 1 hour great riches came to nothing. That's the end. There will be no more great riches in any physical object. And this was prophesied in Ezekiel 7:19. "They will throw their silver into the streets, and their gold will be like garbage. Their silver and gold will not deliver them in the day of the wrath of the Lord. They will not satisfy their souls, nor fill their stomachs, because it became their stumbling block of iniquity." All of that stuff on the day of judgment will be useless. You can't buy your way into heaven. So physical treasure can be an idol, and it's called there a stumbling block of iniquity, and all of that will become nothing on the day of judgment. So then, what use are physical treasures then? Are they useless? Certainly not. God often blesses us with treasures for good reasons. One use is pointed out in 1 Timothy 6:17. Paul writing to his student Timothy at Ephesus. "Instruct those who are rich in this present world not to be conceited or to fix their hope on the uncertainty of riches, but on God who richly supplies us with all things to enjoy." So when we have a surplus, we can sometimes use it for special times of enjoyment. We can take a special vacation or buy an item that was beyond our means before. That's one purpose, sometimes, of a surplus. But the more obvious reason for God to sometimes give you surplus and riches is found in 2 Corinthians 9. So turn over there to 2 Corinthians 9. We will read verses 6 through 11. I think we looked at this passage several months ago, but this is a good time for a reminder. 2 Corinthians 9, verses 6 through 11. "But this I say, he who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and he who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. So let each one give as he purposes in his heart, not grudgingly or of necessity, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to make all grace abound toward you, that you, always having all sufficiency in all things, may have an abundance for every good work. As it is written, he has dispersed abroad, he has given to the poor, his righteousness endures forever. Now may he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food, supply and multiply the seed you have sown, and increase the fruits of your righteousness, while you are enriched in everything for all liberality, which causes thanksgiving through us to God." And we talked about this passage several months ago when I did a special topic on tithing. In the Old Testament, the tithe was just the 10% minimum gift of your income to the church to be used for basic ministry. But above that, there were gifts to the poor and funding of special ministries. So Paul in this letter is saying how wonderful it is that the Corinthians have donated money to the poor churches who are suffering from famines around the region. Paul says, God has blessed you so that you can be liberal to bless others. The promise of the Bible is that God's people will be a blessing to the whole earth, and liberality and generosity is one way we do that. And that's why we fund missionaries, and we are prepared for mercy ministries when needed. Surplus is not all meant for you. Surplus is meant for you to be a blessing to others, because that glorifies God. John Piper wrote, "The greatest cause in the world is joyfully rescuing people from hell, meeting their earthly needs, making them glad in God, and doing it with a kind, serious pleasure that makes Christ look like the treasure he is." In other words, you glorify God by your generosity. So now we've looked at the physical treasures. It's time to look at the eternal treasures or other kinds of treasures. For example, there are emotional treasures. I read an article some years ago doing some psychological thinking about differences between men and women, And it referenced a study asking this question. They asked men and women, thousands of them, if there was a fire in your house and all of your family and pets were already safe outside, and you had 1 minute to safely grab whatever you could without harm to yourself, what would you grab? And almost all of the men said they would grab their wallets, their computers, their electronics, their stocks and bonds, anything that was valuable. And almost all the women said they would go for their old photo albums. Now, there's a big difference. If that is true, it gives some idea of the priorities of the different sexes. Men were thinking more practically, perhaps, while the ladies were thinking more emotionally about the lost memories. Just recently, that Klamath Falls fire, I read that several ladies were mourning the loss of all their photos because now they no longer have photos of their children and things like that. So that is an emotional kind of a treasure. Similar to that, though, spiritual treasures exist, and they can seem to be abstract. Gold and silver and surplus can be used as spiritual treasure when they are purposed for virtuous deeds. So you can use physical treasures to be spiritual treasures. When your funds are used to help others, that generosity is a blessing both to you and the recipients. However, there are some spiritual treasures that have nothing whatsoever to do with commodities or cash. And this is implied in Revelation 3, verses 17 and 18, in the letter of the church to Laodicea, sent by John. So here's what John wrote to Laodicea. Of course, through the mouth of Jesus. Because you say, I am rich and have become wealthy and have need of nothing, and you do not know that you are wretched, miserable, poor, blind, and naked, I counsel you to buy from me gold refined in the fire, that you may be rich, and white garments that you may be clothed, that the shame of your nakedness may not be revealed, and anoint your eyes with eye salve, that you may see. So Jesus warns this church that their wealth has led them to forget God and to greatly underestimate their danger. In other words, you guys are naked and poor and blind, and you think you're Christians, and you're not. What they need is true, pure, refined gold that only comes from God. And they need purity of white garments, and they need a remedy against their blindness. So in other words, these people lack purity and wisdom. These are the kinds of treasures beyond the gold and silver value. For instance, salvation. Putting on white robes is symbolic of being purified by Jesus Christ, taking on his righteousness. So salvation is a spiritual treasure. There are other kinds of spiritual treasures, and this theme is often found in the book of Proverbs. For example, Proverbs 3, 13 through 15. Happy is the man who finds wisdom, and the man who gains understanding. For her proceeds are better than the profits of silver, and her gain than fine gold. She is more precious than rubies, and all the things you may desire cannot compare with her. So wisdom is certainly more than knowledge, but knowledge is a big part of wisdom. There has to be a foundation of truth in order to have wisdom about. So now turn over to Colossians. Colossians chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. And it's interesting that in Paul's letter to Colossae, he also mentions Laodicea, we just read about. So Colossians chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. For I want you to know what a great conflict I have for you and those in Laodicea. For as many as have not seen my face in the flesh, that their hearts may be encouraged, being knit together in love, and attaining to all the riches of the full assurance of understanding, to the knowledge of the mystery of God, both of the Father and of Christ, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. There's a lot in there about treasures. There's two kinds of riches and treasures used here by Paul. Encouragement can come to these churches like riches by assurance of the understanding and knowledge of God. And the treasures are the wisdom and knowledge of God in the Father and the Son. Wisdom and knowledge and encouragement are intangible treasures. They can't be measured or weighed with rulers or scales because they're spiritual gifts given to God's people. And obviously, or surely, it's the Holy Spirit who applies these treasures to our hearts in the knowledge of God. Now, these kind of spiritual treasures were also seen in Isaiah 33, verses 5 and 6. The Lord is exalted, he dwells on high. He has filled Zion with justice and righteousness. Wisdom and knowledge will be the stability of your times, and the strength of salvation. The fear of the Lord is his treasure. So in this verse in Isaiah, justice and righteousness, wisdom and knowledge are the stability of a nation along with salvation. And all of that is summarized by the fear of the Lord is his treasure. Don't we wish that we as a nation could have that kind of treasure? But right now it exists only among God's people, and the church models this kind of treasure. The church, born from Jesus Christ and the apostles, is now the people of God. It is not the nation of Israel. And it will never again be a nation that is the people of God. The kingdom of God will take over the earth entirely when the judgment day comes and not before. We are a light on a hill, the salt of the earth, the blessing of the nations, and the church, we are not nations or governments. And this is one of the things that people just will never give up on. It seems that some Christians still want the church to take over the world, but that is not the kingdom that Jesus planned. The Jews wanted a military Messiah to destroy their enemies, and nowadays some Christian folks seem to want a strong president to destroy their enemies. Can you not see that the world empire system of world governments is gone? The book of Daniel prophesied 4 last empires: Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. And they would all be destroyed by this final kingdom that is a rock unformed by human hands that takes over the world. But it is not an empire in the same way. Those other empires in the visions came up out of the oceans as monsters, devouring and eating and killing. The final kingdom of Jesus is built on teaching, love, mercy, humility, wisdom, and example. So this final empire is an empire of teaching and truth, not an empire of violence and political things. So similarly, it is a mistake to believe any longer that your security or your happiness should be based on your possessions. There's no reason to believe your possessions will help you in any way. Barns full of expensive commodities cannot bring you salvation or happiness. Pirate treasures are the treasures of fools who have no concept of salvation or godliness. Stocks and bonds and gold and silver are the treasures of fools. At best, earthly wealth is only a tool to use to promote spiritual goods, protecting and feeding and caring for people. And remember that your wealth is not your own. The tithe is just a symbol of giving the first fruits to God. All of your possessions and money belong to God, and you should use it, like the Corinthian church, to do good deeds that glorify Jesus. So the last text I want you to turn to is 2 Corinthians 4. Another passage from the book of 2 Corinthians. Chapter 4, we'll start at verse 17 and read about 4 verses up to 5:1. 2 Corinthians 4:17 through 5:1. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory, while we do not look at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things that we see are temporary, but the things which are not seen are eternal. For we know that if our eternal house, this tent, is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. Now you can go astray on this passage and begin to think that physical is bad and heavenly is good, thus forgetting that truly our eternal house is in the heavens because God lives in the heavens. But then the city of houses, the New Jerusalem in the heavens, will be moved to earth forever. So it's not a matter of separating physical things from spiritual things like that. But the main point is, all the treasures you now see and cherish are not treasures you will have forever. They may indeed exist forever, but they won't belong to you anymore. What you think is treasure now, gold, silver, donuts, will not be that great in your sight in the New Jerusalem. The walls will have precious gems stuck in them, and the streets will be paved with gold. But you will not be taking a knife out and prying the gems up or digging up the gold with a shovel, because they will no longer have any economic value. All therefore is decoration in eternity. So then what will have value in eternity? Not gold, not buying or selling or earning money. Now, there will be food, it seems. There is at the very least a marriage supper of the Lamb. And presumably there will be similar celebrations of food and drink for all eternity as we revel in the abundance of God's provision. But since food will not be scarce, you don't have to save it or hoard it for future use. And it will simply have aesthetic value. It won't even give energy to your body. Your body won't need energy anymore. It'll just make your taste buds happy. There will be animals in the new earth. Personally, I believe that will include our long-lost pets, restored by the cosmic Christ, who repairs everything that is broken and that suffered wrongly for sin. And so they will be fond treasures for you. Some of your friends and your relatives and your ancestors and your descendants will be in the new earth. Hopefully many of them. And they will be extra fond treasures for you. And the greatest treasure of all will be Jesus Christ himself. If the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart and your neighbor as yourself, that means loving the Lord your God is supposed to be your treasure rather than loving yourself or loving your money. So the treasures in the new earth will be emotional and spiritual, giving joy and happiness as emotional based on the promise of God and the work of Christ as spiritual and eternal. The glory of God in the new earth will not just be his glowing rainbow glory that'll bring color to the whole world, nor his radiant holiness. God's glory will also be the intentional restoration of the whole universe into a better state than it was before the fall. Everything that went bad will be made good. There will be justice and righteousness, wisdom and knowledge, eternal salvation, and the fear of the Lord will be the only love of the Lord in that final epoch. So when Jesus tells the disciples to stop thinking about earthly treasures and instead to focus on eternal treasures, this is what he's talking about. If you can drag your eyes away from the obvious physical realities around you, you can see the spiritual realities around you, then you can better fight against sins like covetousness, selfishness, and greed. Because there's nothing eternal to be gained by piling up money or possessions. Money and possessions are merely tools given to you by God to use like spiritual coupons to cash in to help other people find the glory of the Lord. Let's pray. Oh, Holy Spirit, give us the eyes to see the spiritual truth around us and to realize that what is physical is only temporary, at least insofar as its value to us.